There are moments in history when silence is no longer an option, when the cries of the innocent pierce the night sky, when the rubble of broken homes speaks louder than speeches, and when the world must decide, will it turn its face away, or will it answer the call of justice? In the heart of Gaza, where children's laughter has been replaced by sirens and sorrow, a voice rose from an unexpected place. From the land of Burkina Faso, from a leader barely past his youth, came a thunderous declaration. Ibrahim Traoré, a man who dared to issue an ultimatum to one of the most powerful figures in the Middle East. He told Prime Minister Netanyahu, "Stop these inhumane actions and stop them now. This is not merely politics. This is not merely diplomacy. This is the cry of a generation that refuses to bow to injustice. And tonight, we will walk through the echoes of that ultimatum. We will feel the tremors it sent across nations, and we will ask, what does this mean for Gaza, for Israel, for Africa, and for us all? If you believe justice must always have a voice, then hit that subscribe button, because this channel is where truth finds its home. The stage was not Jerusalem, nor Washington, nor even New York. It was Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, a land often overlooked in global affairs, a country more associated with hardship than with international power. Yet on that day, the voice of Ibrahim Traoré turned this forgotten land into the pulpit of conscience. The scene was charged with anticipation. Cameras rolled. Journalists leaned forward. The young captain, barely in his 30s, stood tall with a calm fury in his eyes. He was not speaking for power, for wealth, or for influence. He was speaking for children buried beneath rubble, for mothers clutching lifeless bodies, for fathers whose hands could no longer protect their families. His words cut like fire through the air. Netanyahu, stop your inhumane actions in Gaza immediately. It was not a polite request. It was not wrapped in the cautious language of diplomats. It was an ultimatum, delivered in the name of humanity itself. And the very fact that it came from a young African leader, from a country that has never held nuclear weapons, never claimed dominion over others, made it ring with a raw, unfiltered power. Burkina Faso, a nation scarred by colonial exploitation, now stood as the moral mirror to the world. For decades, it had been treated as a pawn in the chessboard of great powers. But Traoré, in that moment, turned the pawn into a bishop, a voice crossing borders, a presence impossible to ignore. Let us not underestimate the courage this demanded. To raise one's voice against Israel is to invite immediate scrutiny, criticism, and sometimes even sanctions. To call out Benjamin Netanyahu directly is to walk into the storm of geopolitics. Yet Ibrahim Traoré did not waver. He spoke with the certainty of a preacher delivering a sermon, as though he were less concerned with the reaction of men than with the judgment of history. And history, my friends, will remember this. For Gaza is not just about land or politics. Gaza has become the symbol of suffering that cries out to the heavens. And when Traoré spoke, he joined a lineage of voices that dared to challenge the mighty on behalf of the voiceless. The symbolism was clear. From Africa, a continent that has known chains, whips, and the endless theft of its dignity, came solidarity with Palestine, a people who today taste the bitter fruit of occupation and war. Traoré stood not only as a president, but as a witness, a living reminder that justice delayed is justice denied. The hall was silent for a moment after his words, but the silence was not empty. It was heavy, charged, alive with the realization that something rare had occurred, a leader speaking truth without disguise. It was as though Ouagadougou itself had become a new Geneva, a place where conscience was allowed to speak above strategy. But speeches, as powerful as they may be, are not just about the moment. They are about what comes next. And as Traoré's ultimatum traveled through news outlets, through social media, through whispers in diplomatic circles, the world began to ask, what will Netanyahu do? What will Israel say? Will the voice of Burkina Faso matter in the global chorus? Or will it be dismissed as the cry of a small nation? Because that is the eternal test, is it not? The voice of the righteous often comes from unexpected places. From Bethlehem 2,000 years ago, from Montgomery, Alabama during the civil rights struggle, from Soweto under apartheid, and now, perhaps, from Burkina Faso. But the question is always the same. Will the world listen? This is where the story deepens, for every word uttered by Traoré carried not just the weight of Gaza, but the weight of Africa, the weight of history, and the weight of the powerless standing against the powerful. And so, as the dust of his speech settled, the cameras turned outward, waiting, anticipating, because the world's response would determine whether his ultimatum was a spark that lights a fire or a cry lost in the wind. When Ibrahim Traoré's ultimatum left his lips, it did not vanish into thin air. It reverberated, it unsettled, it provoked. Across the globe, leaders, diplomats, journalists, and everyday citizens felt the shockwave of a small nation daring to confront a giant. The first wave of reaction came from within Africa. Many leaders of the continent had long whispered their discontent about Gaza, but whispers never changed the tide of history. Traoré, by contrast, shouted what others only murmured. In Senegal, in Mali, in South Africa, voices rose in agreement. Crowds in the streets of Bamako and Johannesburg carried his words on banners. Stop the inhumane actions. For them, Traoré had not only spoken to Netanyahu, he had spoken to history, declaring that Africa, once voiceless in world affairs, could no longer be ignored. Yet, as Africa cheered, other corners of the world bristled. In Tel Aviv, officials dismissed his remarks as grandstanding, as irrelevant rhetoric from a leader of a minor state. They said Burkina Faso had no weight, no leverage. But therein lies the irony. What they called weakness was the very source of his strength. He had nothing to lose, and therefore he could speak the truth that others dared not utter. In Washington, reactions were mixed. Some saw Traoré's words as an echo of America's own civil rights tradition, a reminder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. thundering against injustice, even when it was unpopular. But others, bound by political alliances, frowned and labeled his ultimatum as dangerous populism. The American press divided as well. Some newspapers praised the courage of a young African leader, while others asked whether his words would only inflame tensions further. Meanwhile, in Europe, the reaction was more cautious. In Paris and London, officials tried to avoid direct comment. They preferred to speak in vague terms about humanitarian concerns. But ordinary citizens were not so restrained. Social media in France lit up with clips of Traoré's speech. Young activists, many of them from immigrant communities, shared his words with hashtags calling for justice in Gaza. And then there was the Middle East itself. Palestine predictably embraced Traoré as a brother. In Gaza, murals began to appear with his name painted beside their own fallen heroes. Children carried his picture in marches, chanting his name as if it were a shield against despair. For them, Ibrahim Traoré was not simply a president in Africa. He was a symbol that they were not forgotten. Israel, of course, reacted differently. The government issued a sharp rebuke. Netanyahu's allies framed Traoré as naive, uninformed, manipulated. But beneath the official words, there was unease. Because history has shown that great shifts often begin with small sparks, and what seems irrelevant today can become unstoppable tomorrow. The United Nations heard it too. Delegates whispered about the audacity of Burkina Faso. Some rolled their eyes, but others, especially from the global south, nodded with approval. They saw in Traoré a representative of all smaller nations long silenced by the loud voices of power. In backroom conversations, his ultimatum was compared to Fidel Castro's fiery speeches, to Patrice Lumumba's defiance, to Nelson Mandela's insistence on dignity. And perhaps most profoundly, the African diaspora in America and Europe felt a resonance. Here was a young African leader refusing to bow, refusing to be silent in the face of global injustice. For African Americans who still carry the scars of segregation, of inequality, of systemic disregard, Traoré's words struck a chord. He sounded like one of their own, a man who knew the weight of chains and yet refused to let them define his future. All this made his ultimatum more than a soundbite. It became a moment when the forgotten spoke and the powerful were forced, however briefly, to listen. But with every moment of courage comes the question, what now? Words are fire, but fire without wood dies quickly. Could Traoré's bold stand ignite a movement, or would it be smothered by the machinery of power? Would his voice echo into the future, or would it fade as quickly as it rose? For in the theater of world politics, applause is brief, but consequences are long. And so, as Traoré's name trended across continents, as Gaza clung to his solidarity, as Israel pushed back, and as America debated, the question hung heavy in the air. Would this young leader's courage translate into change, or would it vanish into the cold silence of realpolitik? History tells us that words can either fade like smoke or linger like fire. After Ibrahim Traoré's ultimatum, the question was no longer whether he had spoken boldly, but what those words would unleash. The immediate consequence was visibility. Burkina Faso, a nation often hidden behind statistics of poverty and conflict, suddenly stood on the center stage of global news. Major outlets, from Al Jazeera to the BBC, carried headlines with his name. For a leader who had been painted in Western media as a military strongman, this speech reframed him, not as a dictator, but as a voice of moral defiance. Overnight, the name Ibrahim Traoré became synonymous with resistance and courage. But visibility is a double-edged sword. Along with admiration came criticism. Some accused him of exploiting the suffering in Gaza to elevate his own standing. Others, particularly Western commentators, dismissed his speech as grand rhetoric without substance. And yet, the more they criticized, the more his message spread. For every analyst who sneered, 10 ordinary citizens reposted his words on social media, seeing in him a mirror of their own frustrations with global injustice. In Gaza itself, the consequences were emotional. For a people surrounded by walls, bombs, and despair, to hear a president from across the seas demand an end to their suffering was a lifeline. Children painted his face on walls. Families in refugee camps whispered his name. His ultimatum did not stop the bombs, but it gave hope. And sometimes hope itself is a form of resistance. Within Africa, the effects were political. Leaders who had long played safe began to feel the pressure. If Traoré can speak, people asked in Senegal, Nigeria, and Kenya, why can't ours? That question began to ripple through civil society groups, mosques, churches, universities. It was as if Traoré had cracked open a door and others now pushed to widen it. But consequences are not only emotional or symbolic, they are strategic. Israel, stung by the defiance, quietly recalibrated its diplomatic posture toward Africa. Meetings were canceled, delegations postponed. In corridors of power, analysts debated whether Burkina Faso would pay an economic price. Would aid be cut? Would sanctions be considered? To challenge Israel and, by extension, its allies, was no small gamble. Traoré knew this. He understood that his words might cost his nation dearly. But here is the paradox. Sometimes the very act of defiance becomes a shield, because to punish Burkina Faso too openly would only confirm the truth of his critique, that the powerful crush the small. And so Israel's allies hesitated, wary of turning a speech into a movement. In the United States, the consequences took on a cultural dimension. African-American activists invoked Traoré's name at rallies, linking the struggle of Gaza with their own history of oppression. They quoted him as they once quoted Malcolm, as they once quoted King, a young voice daring to confront the empire. This cross-connection between Africa, Palestine, and Black America rekindled an old spirit of solidarity that had been dormant for decades. But let us be honest. The bombs did not stop. Netanyahu did not suddenly reverse course. Gaza continued to suffer. And here lies the tragic tension, that even the most righteous words cannot instantly undo the machinery of war. Traoré's ultimatum was a spark, but Gaza's fire raged on. And so we are left with a bitter blend of consequences, the sweet taste of renewed solidarity, the sour persistence of suffering. Anger and admiration intertwined. The people felt both proud and powerless, both lifted and yet weighed down. This duality is not new. When Nelson Mandela spoke from his prison cell, South Africa did not change overnight. When Dr. King marched through Selma, segregation did not vanish in a day. The power of such voices lies not in immediate results, but in their ability to carve cracks in the wall of injustice, cracks that may one day bring the wall crashing down. And perhaps this is the true consequence of Traoré's ultimatum. Not that it ended the war, but that it reminded the world that silence is complicity, that a young man from a small nation can still rattle the doors of power, that Africa is not a bystander in the story of humanity, but a participant with a voice that must be heard. The consequences are not yet finished. They unfold like waves, in speeches, in protests, in whispers across continents. His words may outlive the news cycle, may outlast the bombs, may find their place in the long story of humanity's fight for justice. But here is the question we must ask ourselves, dear friends. Was Traoré's stand the beginning of a new movement, or merely a flicker soon to be swallowed by the storm? And what do you believe his words will mean 10, 20, 50 years from now? Across the Atlantic, in the United States, the echoes of Ibrahim Traoré's ultimatum landed in a country already divided over its role in the Gaza conflict. For many Americans, particularly within the African-American community, his speech felt like déjà vu. It reminded them of their own long struggle against injustice, of voices that once cried out in Montgomery and Selma in Washington, D.C. To them, Traoré sounded less like a distant foreign president and more like a brother, carrying forward the same unbroken fight for dignity. Churches in Atlanta, Detroit, and Chicago invoked his words in sermons. Activists in New York quoted his ultimatum at rallies outside government buildings. His defiance became part of a wider debate. Is America still the land that stands for freedom, or has it become the empire that props up oppression? That question, sharpened by Traoré's challenge, cut deep into America's political conscience. But within the halls of power in Washington, the reaction was cautious, even dismissive. Lawmakers spoke of responsible diplomacy and balancing interests. They tried to reduce his ultimatum to a soundbite, to strip it of weight. Yet, every attempt to minimize his words only highlighted the gap between official policy and the moral pulse of the people. Globally, the reverberations spread in different tones. In Europe, some governments downplayed the speech, preferring to keep their alliances intact. But citizens in London, Paris, and Berlin picked it up like a torch, chanting Traoré's words during marches for Palestine. The establishment may have brushed it aside, but the streets remembered. In the Middle East, his voice became a banner of hope. Palestinians saw in him a leader who was unafraid to call injustice by its name. Across the Arab world, commentators praised the courage of a young African president, contrasting his clarity with the silence of wealthier, more powerful states. Meanwhile, in Moscow and Beijing, Traoré's defiance was noted with interest. For them, it was a sign that the old Western order, where small nations kept silent, was crumbling. His speech was woven into their own narratives of a multipolar world, where even the least powerful could shape global discourse. But perhaps the deepest global impact was symbolic. His ultimatum proved that the moral map of the world is not drawn by GDP, by military might, or by seats on the Security Council. It is drawn by courage. And in that moment, Burkina Faso drew a line that stretched far beyond its borders. Still, questions remain. Will the United States shift its stance, or will its leaders harden against voices like Traoré's? Will Europe continue to stay silent, or will the streets force its hand? Will Africa rally around this defiance, or will it splinter under pressure? For if one young leader can awaken the conscience of nations, what might happen if a chorus of voices rises behind him? And what then would the world look like? When Ibrahim Traoré stood and issued his ultimatum, he was not merely reacting to the suffering of Gaza. He was planting a seed, a vision of what leadership could look like when it is unafraid of truth. But the road ahead for both Gaza and Burkina Faso is uncertain and filled with storms. For Gaza, the immediate road remains dark. The bombs do not stop because of a speech. The checkpoints do not vanish because of a declaration. Children still cry at night, and mothers still bury their dead. Yet even in that darkness, a spark now glows. The knowledge that their plight is not invisible, that across the seas a leader dared to say their suffering matters. That spark, if nourished, could fuel greater solidarity, greater pressure, greater hope. For Burkina Faso, the path forward is both promising and perilous. Traoré has gained admiration, but admiration alone does not shield against the economic or political retaliation that may follow. Will his nation pay a price in aid, in trade, in diplomatic isolation? Or will it instead find new allies, new partnerships, forged by respect rather than dependency? That is a question the coming years will answer. But beyond the immediate calculations lies something deeper. The road ahead is about the soul of leadership itself. Traoré represents a generation unshackled by the timid caution of the past. If he holds to this path, if other African leaders dare to follow, then Africa may cease to be the silent continent in global affairs. It may become a voice that insists on justice, not only for itself, but for all oppressed peoples. And what of us, the watchers, the listeners, the ordinary citizens of the world? The road ahead is not only his, but ours. For no leader can carry the burden of justice alone. If Traoré's courage awakens something in us, a refusal to accept silence, a demand for moral clarity, then his ultimatum will not be a solitary moment. It will be the beginning of a movement. Yet movements, like roads, are uncertain. They twist. They stumble. They sometimes collapse under the weight of opposition. The real test will be whether we choose to walk it together. So the question before us tonight is not only about Traoré or Netanyahu, it is about us. Will we remember Gaza when the headlines move on? Will we stand with the small nations when the powerful try to dismiss them? Will we allow justice to remain a slogan, or will we make it a reality? For the road ahead is waiting, And it is shaped not only by the leaders who speak, but by the people who decide to listen. And the choice is still before us. Will we walk in silence, or will we walk in justice? History does not always move with the sound of cannons or the signing of treaties. Sometimes it moves with the trembling voice of a child, with the echo of a sermon, or with the defiance of a leader who dares to speak when silence is safer. Ibrahim Traoré's ultimatum to Netanyahu belongs to this tradition. It may not have ended the bombs, but it cut through the noise of politics and demanded that the world look at Gaza not as a statistic, but as a wound crying for healing. For Gaza, the journey continues, heavy with sorrow, yet also carried by the solidarity of unexpected voices. For Burkina Faso, the young captain has placed his nation into the story of our times, not as a bystander, but as a witness who testifies to truth. For all of us, his words pose a question that cannot be ignored. Will we choose complicity, or will we choose conscience? The preacher in me must tell you, the road of conscience is never easy. It will cost us comfort. It will cost us favor. It will sometimes cost us friends. But it is the only road that leads to justice, and justice is the only soil in which peace can truly grow. So tonight, as we close this reflection, I ask you not only to remember Traoré's words, but to weigh them against your own heart. What would you do if you stood in his place? Would you speak, or would you remain silent? Would you side with the powerful, or would you stand with the powerless? If you believe that truth must always be spoken, if you believe that the cries of Gaza, of Africa, of every oppressed people must never be forgotten, then let your voice be heard. Leave a comment below, share your thoughts, and let us build a community where conscience is not a whisper, but a chorus. And remember this, justice may seem delayed, but it cannot be denied forever. The stones cry out, the rivers remember, and history bends, slowly, painfully, but surely, towards righteousness. Subscribe to this channel if you want to journey with us, to hear more voices like the Ibrahim Traoré speech, to understand the courage behind Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso, and to stand with truth in a world drowning in noise. Because together our voices can turn sparks into flames, and flames into light for generations to come.